The dog didn't want to be there. Anyone could see it. The way he kept his head low, shoulders braced, every muscle along his spine coiled tight like something waiting to snap. He was a Belgian Malinois, black-muzzled and lean, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm but from discipline. From years of being told to hold it together no matter what. Juniper Walsh recognized that kind of stillness. She'd worn it herself plenty of times, standing in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, waiting for news she didn't want to hear. She was 31 years old and had been a licensed veterinary technician at Crestfall Animal Hospital for going on 6 years. She knew dogs. She knew the ones that bit because they were mean and the ones that bit because they were scared. And she knew that this particular dog, was neither. He was hurting. She could see it in the way he shifted his weight, barely perceptible, off his left rear leg. Whatever was wrong with him had been wrong for a while. The man holding his leash was a different story. Staff Sergeant Cole. He'd introduced himself that way at the front desk, last name only, the way some military guys did, like a first name was a vulnerability. Stood at roughly 6'2", with the kind of posture that came from years of being told to take up space and mean it. He was maybe 35, broad through the shoulders, wearing civilian clothes that somehow still looked like a uniform. There was a scar along his left jaw that Juniper didn't stare at. She'd learned not to stare. He'd said, very clearly when the receptionist tried to reach down to greet the dog, "Don't touch him. He'll bite. Not he might bite. Not he's a little nervous today. He'll bite. Flat. Certain." The kind of tone that closed a conversation before it opened. The receptionist Meg had pulled her hand back fast. She'd shot Juniper a look across the counter. The look that meant you deal with this one, and Juniper had come around from the back with a clipboard and a calm she'd spent years building. "I'm Juniper," she said. "I'll be taking care of." She glanced at the intake sheet. "Raze today." Staff Sergeant Cole looked at her the way people sometimes looked at vet techs, like she was the warm-up act before the real show. "Where's Dr. Fenn?" "Dr. Fenn is finishing up with another patient. She'll be in shortly. I'm going to do the initial assessment. I'd rather wait." "Of course." Juniper kept her voice easy. "We can wait. But Raze has been favoring his left rear leg since you came in, and I'd like to get a look at it sooner rather than later." That landed. She watched Cole's jaw tighten slightly, not with anger, but with something more complicated, the way people looked when someone named a thing they'd been trying not to see. "Fine," he said, "but don't touch him without warning him first. I never do." She led them back to exam room 2, which was the quietest room in the clinic, no window to the street, fluorescent lights on a dimmer, a rubber mat on the floor instead of the cold steel table they used for smaller animals. She'd set it up that way herself 2 years ago, after a shepherd mix had come in post-surgery and spent the whole exam shaking against the wall. Some dogs needed a room that felt like somewhere they could breathe. Cole stood by the door. Raze stayed close to his left leg, head still low, but he was watching Juniper. Not the way dogs watched strangers, alert, suspicious. He was watching her the way animals sometimes watched people they were trying to figure out. She crouched down, not moving closer, just got herself to his level and let him look. "What's he been doing?" she asked Cole, keeping her eyes on the dog. "Nothing. Eating fine, drinking fine, sleeping okay?" A pause. "He gets up a lot at night. Does he lick the leg? The left rear one?" Another pause, longer. "Sometimes." She nodded, like this was ordinary information. It was to her. To Cole, she suspected, it had been a thing he'd been watching for weeks and trying to decide wasn't serious. How long has he been limping? He's not limping. Juniper looked up, not to challenge him, just to meet his eyes. He's putting about 40% less weight on his left rear than his right. It's subtle. You'd only catch it if you were watching him move closely. She held Cole's gaze for just a second, which obviously have been. Cole looked away first. His hand, she noticed, had dropped to his side, instinctively, maybe, to the place where Raze's head would have been if the dog had been standing differently. An old habit. The kind that formed in the field. Raze had been a working dog. She'd clocked that the moment they walked in. The way he moved, the way he held his attention, divided between the room and his handler. The faint scar tissue along the inside of his left ear from an old headset. Belgian Malinois were common in military work. She'd treated 3 others over the past year. They came in hard and guarded, and sometimes so far past their threshold that even the exam room lights bothered them. But Raze was watching her, and he hadn't growled. She reached into the basket on the shelf without breaking her posture, slow, visible movements, nothing sudden, and took out a small piece of freeze-dried liver treat. She placed it on the floor about 2 feet in front of her. Then she waited. "He doesn't take food from strangers," Cole said. Raze looked at the treat, then at Juniper, then back at the treat. Cole made a small sound, almost a scoff, barely audible. The sound of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and was already composing his reaction to it. Raze took 1 step forward. Cole went very still. The dog moved to the treat, sniffed it once, and ate it. Then he raised his head and looked at Juniper with an expression that was, in its own way, almost questioning. She'd seen it before, not often, but a handful of times, in dogs that had been very well trained by people who loved them. The expression wasn't submission and it wasn't aggression. It was something closer to all right then. "What do you know?" "Raze," she said quietly. Not a command, just his name, the way you'd say a person's name when you wanted them to know you'd heard them. The dog's ears shifted slightly. His weight settled back, just a fraction, off the guarded forward lean he'd been holding since they walked in. Cole's scoff had gone somewhere she couldn't see. She extended the back of her hand, low, palm down. Raze stepped toward her. She let him sniff her wrist, her forearm, the inside of her elbow, where she'd spent 10 minutes before the shift washing her hands with the unscented soap she kept in her locker. Some handlers didn't know how much smell mattered to working dogs. She did. When Raze pressed his nose briefly against her palm and then simply stood there, she began the exam. She worked slowly and methodically, talking to the dog in a low, even voice as she did. Not the high-pitched reassurance some techs defaulted to. "Good boy, yes you are, such a good boy," but just a steady narration of what she was doing. "I'm going to check your shoulder now. This might feel a little tight." "Good. You're doing great. I'm going to move to your back now." When she reached the left rear leg, Raze flinched. Not dramatically, a small full-body shiver the way a horse's flank will twitch at a fly. But she felt it, and she stopped and she waited until he settled before she continued. The joint was warm. Not hot, not inflamed the way an acute injury would be, but a consistent low-level warmth that told her this had been building for months, possibly longer. She palpated carefully along the stifle, watching Raze's face the whole time. He bore it. That was the thing about well-trained military dogs. They bore things. They'd been taught to push through, which meant whatever was hurting him had been hurting him long enough that he'd built a whole layer of stoicism on top of it. She stood up slowly. Raze watched her. "His stifle joint is inflamed," she told Cole. "His cruciate ligament, that's the ligament that stabilizes the knee, is probably compromised. I'd want x-rays to confirm. It's common in working dogs, especially high-impact breeds. The joint takes a lot of stress over years of field work." She paused. "Has he been retired long?" Cole's expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite read. 8 months. How old is he? 7. 7 was getting up there for a working Malinois. Not old, but the body started accounting for the mileage. And before retirement, how long was he active? 4 years. She did the math. Raze had been working since he was 3. 4 years of high-intensity field work on joints that were already under constant strain. The limp wasn't new. The awareness of the limp was new. He probably masked it well in the field, she said. Working dogs often do. They're wired to push through. It's only when the pressure comes off that you start to see it clearly. She kept her voice neutral, factual. She wasn't drawing the parallel on purpose. Or maybe she was, a little, but she was subtle about it. Cole had his arms crossed now. He was looking at Raze. "Is it bad?" he asked, and his voice had changed. She couldn't have said exactly how. It was quieter, maybe. Less defended. "It's manageable," she said. "Depends on what the x-rays show. Could be conservative treatment, anti-inflammatories, joint supplements, controlled exercise, physical therapy. Could be surgical if the tear is significant. But the earlier we catch it, the better the outcome." She glanced at him. "The fact that he's not showing more acute symptoms suggests it's still in a stage where we have good options." Cole nodded slowly. Raze, still standing near Juniper, leaned slightly to the left, not toward Cole, just sideways, the smallest possible increment, until his shoulder was just barely touching Juniper's knee. He didn't look at her. He was watching the wall, but he was touching her. Cole saw it. She knew because she heard the change in his breathing, that small, involuntary adjustment, like something had just shifted in him that he hadn't expected to move. Dr. Fenn came in 10 minutes later, reviewed Juniper's notes, confirmed the initial assessment, and scheduled Raze for imaging the following morning. Cole took the paperwork and the instructions and stood for a moment at the exam room door. He doesn't usually. He started, then stopped. Juniper waited. He was with me the whole deployment, Cole said, finally. Both of them. He meant both tours, she thought, but she didn't ask him to clarify. He slept outside my rack when I had the worst fever of my life. Pulled me through a drainage ditch once. I don't know how, he's 62 pounds, but he managed it. Cole looked at Raze, who had gone back to standing at his handler's left heel, patient and alert. He does everything right, never complains. I kept telling myself he was fine. Juniper looked at the dog, then at the man. She understood in that moment that what Cole was really saying had nothing to do with the dog. He's going to be okay, she said quietly, and it was right to bring him in when you did. Cole held her gaze for just a moment. Then he nodded, once, like something had been decided. He and Raze walked out through the waiting room, and Meg watched them go with the expression of someone who had been waiting in the wings and was now debating whether to say "I told you so" or not. She settled for raising both eyebrows at Juniper. Juniper just went back to wash her hands. Raze came in the next morning for imaging, and Cole came with him, arrived 15 minutes early actually, which Juniper registered without comment. He was less rigid than the day before. Not relaxed, exactly, but the way wood becomes when it's been in water for a little while. Still solid, but with some of the brittleness gone. The X-rays confirmed a partial cranial cruciate ligament tear in the left stifle. Not a full rupture, which was the better news. Dr. Fenn walked Cole through the imaging and the options, conservative management with strict rest, and a graduated return to low-impact movement, or a TPLO surgery that would give Raze a more structurally stable outcome long-term. Cole asked good questions, precise, structured, the way people asked questions when they were used to making decisions with incomplete information and needed to get it right. He chose the surgery. Dr. Fenn scheduled it for the following week. On his way out, Cole stopped at the front desk where Juniper was updating Raze's file. He stood there for a second. She looked up. "Is there a specific thing he should or shouldn't eat before surgery?" he asked. She told him, nothing after midnight the night before, no treats after 10, water until 6 a.m. Standard pre-op protocol. She printed it out for him. He folded the paper in half and put it in his shirt pocket without looking at it. "Thank you," he said. "Yesterday, it's my job." "No," he said simply. It wasn't. She didn't have an answer for that, so she just nodded, and he left, and she sat with it for a minute after the door closed. The way certain things sometimes sat with her, not heavily, but with a kind of weight that wasn't unpleasant. The surgery went well. Raze was a model patient in recovery, which didn't surprise Juniper at all, because of course he was. Working dogs in post-op were often the easiest animals in the ward and the hardest to watch. They were too disciplined to fight the e-collar or fuss with their bandaging, but that same discipline meant they absorbed discomfort the way they absorbed everything else, quietly, without complaint. You had to watch them carefully. Pain in a trained dog didn't always announce itself the way it did in other animals. Juniper was on the morning shift for Raze's first 3 days of recovery, and she checked on him every 2 hours, keeping her notes meticulous and her voice steady. By day 2, he'd started to recognize her footsteps in the corridor. She could tell by the way his ears would angle toward the door about 10 seconds before she opened it. Cole came in for every allowed visit. He was allowed 30 minutes in the morning and 30 in the evening during the acute recovery phase. He never asked for more than that, but he was also never late. He'd sit on the floor of the recovery kennel, back against the wall, and Raze would put his head in Cole's lap and they'd just be there together, not talking, not doing anything, just existing in the same space the way some people and their animals did, in a language that had nothing to do with words. Once, on the 3rd evening, Juniper came in to do a check while Cole was still there. She went through the exam quietly, temperature, sight assessment, range of motion, hydration, and when she finished she looked up to find Cole watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. Not the defensive appraisal from the first day. Something more considered. "You do that the same way every time," he said. She glanced up. "Do what?" "The exam. Same order, same pace." "You talked to him the whole way through. Consistency matters for recovery animals," she said. "Especially working dogs, routine is safety for them." He was quiet for a moment. He listens to you differently than he listens to most people. She considered how to answer that. He's smart, she said. He's noticed that nothing I've done has hurt him more than necessary. Dogs are empiricists. They go by evidence. Cole looked at Raze, who had his eyes half closed with his head still in Cole's lap. He bit the first vet tech who tried to assess him, he said. 18 months ago, different clinic. Juniper processed that. What happened? Tech reached over his head without warning him. Fast movement. Raze was coming down from a training op, elevated cortisol, high alert. The tech ended up with 14 stitches. Cole said it without drama, just as information. I had to sign a lot of forms after that. Was told by the base vet to keep him muzzled for all future appointments. Juniper looked at Raze, currently the most relaxed 62 pounds of muscle she'd ever seen. You didn't muzzle him when you came in. No, Cole said. He didn't elaborate. She wondered about that on the drive home. About what it meant that he hadn't. That he'd walked into a new clinic with a dog that had a documented bite history and a warning he'd clearly been told to heed, and he'd just trusted his own read of the situation. Or trusted Raze's read of it. She wasn't sure which. Both, maybe. Raze was discharged on day 6 with a full post-op care packet, a follow-up schedule, and a physical therapy plan that Juniper had put together herself based on the protocols she'd trained on the previous spring. She walked Cole through it at the front desk, the passive range of motion exercises, the controlled leash walks, the icing schedule, the signs of setback to watch for. Cole listened with his full attention the way she'd come to expect, asking questions at exactly the right moments, repeating key points back to confirm he had them right. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then asked the physical therapy. Do you do that here, or does he go somewhere else? We have a K9 rehabilitation set up in the back, she said. I run the sessions. He'd come in twice a week for the first month, then we'd scale based on progress. Cole nodded. Something in his face settled, almost imperceptibly. Then we'll see you Thursday, he said. The Thursday sessions established a rhythm. Raze made excellent progress. The kind of progress that was satisfying in the way all hard-won things were, incremental and undeniable. The first session, he could bear weight on the leg for about 30 seconds before needing a break. By the 4th session, he was walking the short corridor with barely a perceptible hitch. Cole sat in the corner of the rehabilitation room for every session, and after the 3rd week, Juniper stopped noticing he was there, and then, somewhere around the 4th week, started noticing again. It was small things. The way he'd hand her the stretch band before she reached for it, having watched her enough times to know what came next. The way he asked questions that were, increasingly, not only about Raze. He asked her how she'd gotten into veterinary medicine. He asked her if she'd always worked with working dogs or if that had developed over time. He asked once carefully if she'd ever treated an animal she knew wasn't going to get better. She'd answered that one honestly. Yes, more times than she liked. And it never got easier, but you learned to be present for it instead of braced against it. He'd been quiet for a long moment after that. My brother, he said, then stopped. Then, he had a dog, old shepherd mix, when we were kids. He didn't continue. He didn't have to. She understood that he'd been thinking about something while she was talking and had let a part of it out before he meant to. What was the dog's name? She asked. Cole looked up. The question had surprised him. She could tell. People didn't usually ask the dog's name. Brick, he said. And then, almost involuntarily, he smiled. Just briefly, just one corner of his mouth, the scar along his jaw pulling slightly. But it was a real smile, the kind that came from somewhere actual, and it changed his whole face in a way she wasn't prepared for. She looked back at Raze and focused on the exercise. Week 6, Raze hit a milestone, a full 10-minute controlled walk with no compensatory gait. Juniper documented it, shared the measurements with Dr. Fenn, and came back to the rehabilitation room to find Cole standing near the low-balance platform with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face she'd come to recognize as the precursor to him saying something he'd been working up to. She waited. I was told, he said, when they paired us, Raze and me, that working dogs don't bond like pets do, that they're partners, not companions, that you maintain the relationship professionally. He paused. I believed that for about a week. Juniper set down her clipboard, and then one night in country, he crawled under my cot and put his chin on my boot and just stayed there. Cole looked at Raze, who was now sitting at the far end of the room watching them both with alert patience. I woke up 6 hours later and he was still there. Hadn't moved. Wasn't asleep, just staying. Raze, as if he'd heard something he recognized in Cole's voice, stood up and walked over and sat down right next to Cole's leg, not pressed against him, just close. Cole looked down at him. He does that, he said, quietly, shows up. Juniper stood very still. I know, she said. He looked at her. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the distant hum of the HVAC and the soft sound of Raze's breathing and nothing else. There's a place, Cole said, a few blocks from here. Vietnamese coffee place. I've walked past it 3 times in the past 2 weeks, trying to figure out if asking would be. He stopped. Complicated. She thought about what to say. She thought about the folder of professional ethics she'd kept carefully filed in her head for the past 6 weeks. She thought about the drive home on the night she'd learned about the bite incident, about the question she'd turned over and not answered. It's not complicated, she said. Cole let out a breath, just a small one, almost silent. Raze, beside him, lay down and put his nose on his front paws. Thursday, Cole said. After the session? Thursday, she said. The coffee place was warm and a little too loud and exactly the kind of place where conversations could go sideways or somewhere real, and theirs went somewhere real. They talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She knew because she checked her phone when she got back to her car and sat in the dark parking lot for a minute, just registering the fact that 2 hours and 40 minutes had gone by, and she couldn't identify a single moment in it that she'd wanted to be somewhere else. He told her about the deployment. Not the tactical details, he was careful about that, and she didn't push, but the texture of it. The particular quality of the boredom between the parts that weren't boring at all. The way Raze had been the most constant thing in an environment designed to be unpredictable. He told her about coming home the second time and not knowing how to exist in quiet, how the stillness felt like a different kind of threat until he learned to let it be just stillness. She told him about her first year at Crestfall, about losing an animal on the table for the first time. A 6-year-old lab named Copper, heart failure, nothing she could have done differently, and driving home and sitting in her kitchen at 2 a.m, unable to eat or sleep, just holding the fact of it. About how she'd gone back in the next morning because there was nothing else to do, and how eventually that had become a kind of answer. You go back in, you keep showing up. Cole had listened to that without filling the silence at the end of it. He'd just nodded, slowly. She liked that about him, the not filling. Raze was cleared for full activity at the 11-week mark. Juniper wrote up the final assessment, filed the imaging comparisons showing the joint recovery, and noted with professional satisfaction that his gait analysis was within normal parameters on all 4 limbs. No compensation, no guarding. On his last official visit, Cole brought her a coffee from the Vietnamese place. Just left it at the front desk before the session started, with her name on the cup in his handwriting, which was precise and slightly cramped. The way left-handed people sometimes wrote when they'd been forced to adapt. She carried the coffee into the rehabilitation room and set it on the shelf. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. Raze, off-leash and doing exactly what he pleased now that he felt like himself again, had gone directly to Juniper's side and was standing next to her with the easy comfort of an animal who had made a decision and was at peace with it. Cole looked at the dog, then at her. His expression was the one she'd come to think of as his actual face, not the defended version from that first day, not the careful professional courtesy from the early sessions, but the real one. The one with the slightly unguarded eyes and the suggestion of that half-smile. He picked right, Cole said. She looked down at Raze, who looked back up at her with absolute equanimity. He usually does, she said. Cole reached down and ran his hand once over Raze's head, a gesture so practiced and familiar it must have happened 1,000 times, in a dozen different countries, in conditions she could only imagine. Raze leaned briefly into his hand, then straightened, then leaned slightly against Juniper's leg. Both of them, she thought, both of them showing up. She picked up her clipboard and documented the final session with the same meticulous care she'd brought to everyone before it. Raze sat at her feet while she wrote. Cole stood a few steps away, hands easy at his sides, not going anywhere. Outside, the morning was doing what mornings did. Going forward, indifferent and unhurried, full of the particular ordinary light that fell through clinic windows and made everything look a little more itself than it usually did. She finished writing. She capped her pen. She looked at the door, then at Cole, and smiled, not a professional smile, not a reassuring the Heller smile, but the kind that came from actually somewhere. "Same time Thursday?" she said. Cole's mouth curved. "For what?" She picked up the coffee from the shelf. It was still warm. "Coffee," she said, obviously.